Researchers, dear friends, my name is Lina Navickaitė-Martinelli, and it is a great honor and pleasure for me to welcome you here at this wonderful event, the third Festival Conference of Music Performance and Artistic Research, Doctors in Performance. We cordially welcome you at the Lithuanian Academy of Music and Theatre. And we do cherish to be entrusted by our partners to host DIP 2018 after its two successful editions, first in Helsinki in 2014 and in Dublin 2016. The event, I believe, is polishing its shape and ideology, and I'm very pleased to notice that the community of Doctors in Performance is growing with every subsequent year. We have received about 100 proposals to this conference, from which we had, unfortunately, to select less, but fortunately to select the best ones. And what we have now, I believe, represents and reflects in a beautiful way the newest tendencies of artistic research in music performance. DIP 2018 features 72 recitals, lecture recitals, and paper presentations. Institutions from 22 countries are represented here, and a great variety of instruments, topics, methodologies, and personalities. And before there will be more talking, which definitely there will be, let us open this event, a true feast of music, knowledge, and sharing, with the performance of Claviola Trio that itself, like all of you, embodies the very title of this event. They will perform a rarely heard work from the 20th century, Leo Smith's trio for clarinet, viola, and piano. And so, Trio Claviola, Doctor of Arts Vytautas Giedraitis, clarinet, Doctor of Arts Jurgis Juozapaitis, viola, and a fourth-year doctoral student of the Lithuanian Academy of Music and Theatre, Ugnė Antanavičiūtė, piano. Trio Claviola. now I would like to invite for a few welcoming words the Rector of the Lithuanian Academy of Music and Theatre, the pianist, Professor Zbignevas Ibelgauptas.
Dear guests and colleagues, I warmly welcome you all in Vilnius at the Lithuanian Academy of Music and Theatre, where already for over 8 decades the traditions of music composition, performance, research, and pedagogy have been developed. The synergy of performance and research provides the performer with more tools and possibilities for self-expression. It empowers to convey issues that are important to performers, not only with the sounds of music, but also with words. I am happy that the 3rd International Festival Conference of Music, Performance and Artistic Research, Doctors in Performance, takes place at our academy, where we have been conducting artistic research in music for about 20 years. I like to think of this impressive event as a trust from our partners and a wonderful chance for our students and professors to observe the newest results of artistic research, and to all the participants the opportunity to share their experience and discuss about it. I wish you all great impressions and smooth communication in words and in sounds of music. And a pleasant stay in Vilnius.
We are very happy to have here the big delegation from the place where Doctors in Performance was born as a concept and as a festival conference. So I welcome here for a few words the Vice Dean for Research and Doctoral Studies from the Sibelius Academy, Helsinki University of the Arts, Tuire Kuusi.
Dear colleagues, dear friends, I don't think we are enemies or not friends after this conference. We know each other very well after a few days. Thank you for the possibility to say a few words on behalf of the, if we can say, founding member of the conference, the Sibelius Academy, UniArts Helsinki. As we heard, the idea of the conference originally arose in Docmus Doctoral School at the Sibelius Academy. We had noticed that there are plenty of conferences, even music conferences, where music is discussed and research papers and posters are presented, but musical examples are scarce or even non-existing. This is why we decided to arrange a conference with focus on music performances and lecture recitals. We heard that there have been 2 Doctors in Performance conferences already. They were very successful, and it seems that this 3rd one will be yet another success. It seems that there really is a need for a conference like this, where performers can be able to present their doctoral or postdoctoral projects, where they can discuss their topics and share ideas. We know that research can be conducted in various ways. When we are doing research on music, one essential part, but of course not the only one, is the musician's knowledge concerning musical practice. A musician can study music by studying him or herself in the very act of working with music, whether practicing, composing, or presenting. And this is something that can be demonstrated in a conference where performance is a crucial part. And this is what we will have during the next few days. And you will make the conference as it will be. So I wish us a very great conference.
There's really little to add now to what has been said before me, only thanking the people without whom this would have been either impossible or much more difficult. I'm indebted to the DIP steering committee, who not only have gone through all the proposals, but were there with helping to set the program and to keep up the good spirits throughout the preparation process. So these are Anu Vehvilainen and Margus Kuika from Sibelius Academy, Denise Neary, Royal Irish Academy of Music, and Sarah Collis, Royal Music Academy of London. We also had a local organizing committee at the Lithuanian Academy of Music and Theatre who helped in all possible ways. Ana Blamonova, Daiva Buividienė, Rūta Karbonskytė, Mantautas Krukauskas, Rūta Lipinaitytė, Rasa Murauskaitė, Rima Rimšaitė, and Judita Žukienė. A cordial thanks to them all and to other colleagues and doctoral students who have been helping and still are and will be helping and giving a hand in all this. I thank you all for being here. I thank all the piano accompanists and piano coaches and wives and husbands who came here to support our performers. And some practical information before we continue with the first presentation of the DIP 2018. You all have the programs, I hope, and you have consulted them. So after the first keynote, we will all have the refreshments break in the foyer of the second floor downstairs there in front of the Juozas Karosas hall. At 3:30 sharp, I hope, we begin 4 parallel sessions. Please choose the ones that are most interesting to you. I know it's impossible. And an important info concerning this evening. So those who wish to attend the guided tour to the exhibition that will be right before the opening reception at the National Art Gallery, please be at the Art Gallery at 6:10. You will be then divided on the spot to 2 groups, or there will be even 1 group. They will see simply how many of you gather, so just please be there. If you are a bit late, you'll be still let through, but we would really appreciate if you are there at 6:10. And now, well, every single performance and presentation during these days will be a key event to us. But there are 2 that are officially called keynotes. So let me introduce our first distinguished guest, pianist and musicologist, professor of musical performance studies at the University of Cambridge, fellow and director of studies at St. John's College, and director of Cambridge Digital Humanities, Professor John Rink.
A very warm thank you for the invitation to come to this conference, to speak at it, to launch it, the first, I suppose, official paper. It's a great honor and privilege on my very first visit to Vilnius, which is already looking very auspicious with this wonderful conference ahead. It's a particular pleasure to be able to present aspects of my own work, both some theoretical work in the first part of the paper, and then some very personal work that I've done as a musician and musicologist and in other capacities, building very much on the comments that have been made by the initial speakers today. The presentation, as you can see, is called Beyond Interpretation, Musical Performance as Creative Practice. And there are at least 2 allusions within this title. The first allusion is to the title of the book of my colleague Nicholas Cook, Beyond the Score. And what I'm going to suggest in speaking about beyond interpretation is not a correction, a corrective to Nicholas Cook's title, but a supplement, because although we must think beyond the score, we must not forget scores either. The second part of the title, Musical Performance is Creative Practice, is an allusion to the research center that I ran in Cambridge, the AHRC Research Center for Musical Performance as Creative Practice, and it attempted to put the accent on the creative elements of performance, what the performer brings to performance that is creative and new, the knowledge embodied in performance. And that is precisely what we will see as the paper progresses. Now, I'd like to start by referring to the struggle between understanding interpretation versus performance, moving then to engaging with musical notation, and then finally creative performance in profile. This first part of the paper will move us from considerations of performance to considerations of the so-called discipline of performance studies. The second part will move us from some primary sources to performance approaches. And then finally, in the last part, we will move to the issue of judging performance, or indeed judging yourself in performance, because I'm going to discuss my experiences as an adjudicator, which I will argue is another form of creative practice. So with this struggle in mind, interpretation versus performance, I have in mind here the, if you will, the limitation of some languages not to have a word such as we have in English for performance. Interpretation is what one tends to say, or a similar term like execution. If you look at the Oxford English Dictionary definition of interpret, you will see that it is almost always a transitive verb. It takes a direct object. One interprets something. Now that's an important notion, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes. If we look instead at the definition of perform, we find that there are intransitive functions of performing, which is to say, one doesn't necessarily perform something, one simply performs. And performance studies is a way of looking at that simply performs. What constitutes, what lies behind performance? How do we explain it? How do we understand it without always thinking about performing something? Yes, we perform things, but that's not all we do. So, what do we interpret? Well, many people would say we interpret music. I would disagree. Let's look at this quote of Roy Howard. Roy Howard, some 20 years ago, wrote, "Ravel's request that pianists not interpret my music, but just play it, focuses the question for performers, can we actually interpret music? Surely not, Roy Howard says, except by grossly distorting it. What we can interpret, indeed can only interpret, is its notation. Since notation, to quote the ever-literal French, partitions music, that is, represents or encodes it in a welter, a sort of mess of mostly binary symbols involving variable conventions and shorthands, it cannot help but distort it, and our task is to read back through the distortions on paper, employing oral and visual awareness, skill, and sensitivity." So Howard suggests that what we interpret is not music but notation. I think this is a very useful point to keep in mind. This brings us to square one. Musical notation, at least in the Western tradition, is underspecified and underdetermined. Therefore, it needs to be completed or complemented. The flip side is that musical notation in the Western performance tradition is overspecified and overdetermined, which means we cannot always take it at face value. We think that the rhythmic material is spelled out, or the dynamics or whatever, but of course we know that that's not the case. Nevertheless, because it's on the page, we say, oh, we have to follow this. We have to play forte. We have to play a dotted rhythm. So we fall in between these two flip sides without necessarily knowing what to do. We have to make a decision. Now we come to some first principles, ones that I've said for some time in a number of cases, including this first. The score is not the music, nor is the music fully represented by the score. This seems obvious, but it's sometimes, in fact, often forgotten. Secondly, the study of musical performance, therefore, must go beyond the notion of interpretation of scores, works, composers' intentions, by aspiring to an understanding of performance as a creative practice. This is, of course, what the presentation is about. Yet, the potential influence of scores, which is to say of musical notation, on creative performance should not be underestimated. That, again, is the point of the presentation. And I've drawn this score-sound continuum, as I show it, to suggest that once you pick up a score and perform from it, learn from it, you never really stop on this continuum. You begin with the music. This doesn't work on this screen, I think. You begin with the music in the score, then you rehearse, you come up perhaps with an initial performance conception, which may feed back to the rehearsal process, or indeed back to the score, or maybe it feeds through to the performance. But after the performance, you could then feed back through more rehearsal, or refine your conception, or look at the score, or whatever. Obviously, this is not by any means meant to be a complete model, but it reminds us that music in score, musical notation, need not be forgotten even if it is memorized. The influence of it is considerable and enduring. Now, this is relevant to the so-called communication chain that we tend to think in terms of, a problematic communication chain, to be sure. Most literature over the course of some 150 years or so has suggested that the composer produces the music, which is passed through the vessel of the performer, a term used in much writing, through the vessel of the performer to the listener. The performer is therefore a conduit, a channel, through which the composer's ideas flow to the listener. This is supposedly the nature of the essence of musical communication. Hence, quotations like this one attributed to Schoenberg. The performer, for all his intolerable arrogance, is totally unnecessary, except as his interpretations make the music understandable to an audience unfortunate enough not to be able to read it in print. I had a student who worked on Schoenberg's performance aesthetics, and he assured me in a detailed study that this was simply attributed to Schoenberg. It doesn't reflect his true belief, but it might as well have done, or at least it represents the views of many writers in the middle of the 20th century. The performer being totally unnecessary. Just play the music, don't get in the way. Now, I'd like to unchain the performer, as it were, by proposing an alternative trajectory. If you like, the composer has ideas about sound, time, gesture, and so forth, which are materialized or reified, made concrete, in the form of musical notation. That's the composer's job, or the composer's achievement. A performer engaging with that notation makes sense, which is to say, makes music of the elements therein. The resultant music is materialized in the act of performance. So we understand this so-called interpretation as an act of sense-making. And then finally, a listener, viewer, analyst, or whatever, someone engaging with a given performance makes sense of its materials, possibly with one or more forms of materialization, writing, a graph, or whatever, as an outcome. Now this, I think, is a healthy corrective to the notion of communication in the chain that I showed you. Each party has a responsibility. Each party has a creative agency. So that brings us to further principles having to do with musical structure. I've referred to materialization, to sense-making. Let's consider what implications these notions have for musical structure. A few years ago, I published an article on practice-based research in a particular project that I'd done in which these principles appeared. Musical materials do not in themselves have or constitute structure. They afford the inference of structural relationships. They invite us to understand relationships between the materials. That is how we make sense of them. But we make sense of them. They don't tell us exactly what the relationships are. Thus, musical structure should be seen as constructed, not immanent, as pluralistic, not singular. Furthermore, because of music's time dependency, musical structure should be understood first and foremost as a process, not as architecture, especially in relation to performance. Now, these first two principles are quite radical. Once you accept them, much of the music theory, music analysis project of the last 80 or so years is called into question. A project which is based on the notion of structure being immanent as to structure being found, being constructed, which is what I would like to encourage us to think of instead. And what I'm going to show you as we progress is some examples of musical structure being heard, being inferred in this process-orientated form that I've alluded to. That will be the goal of the last part of the paper in particular, but also the second part. Now let's consider finally where we are in the field of musical performance studies and use this as a springboard into the rest of the paper. Ian Pace, last year, published an article called The New State of Play in Performance Studies, and this is a direct response to my own article from 2004, The State of Play in Performance Studies. One day somebody will write the new state of play in performance studies, and perhaps then the new. We could get carried away. I will have retired by then, I hope. Now, Ian Pace found 8 categories in this new field, a new state of play: performance as research, performance-based research, artistic research into performance, generally undertaken by practitioners requiring a practical element. That is, of course, what many of us in this room are engaged in. The study of the performance of contemporary art music, ethnographic studies of performance and performers, cultural history and study of performances, studies of performance traditions, including work in popular music studies and ethnomusicology, detailed study of specific performers and groups of performers, historical and comparative performance pedagogy, and finally, study of the theater of performance. Now, if you wish, you may pigeonhole yourselves in any or all of these categories, and perhaps you could propose others. I'm sure they're not exhaustive. What I would like to do is to call to your attention 3 areas in particular: the performance as research, performance-based research, ethnographic studies, and the detailed study of specific performers, because these are the groundwork of what I'm going to show you in part 3 of the paper, the detailed case study of my own work. Let's first proceed to part 2, which makes sense, engaging with musical notation. I'm going to jump right in with a tiny, tiny detail in the music of Frédéric Chopin, whose works I've devoted a great deal of my time to over the years. In a letter that Chopin wrote to his friend Titus Wojciechowski in 1830, he praised a young singer, Konstancja Gładkowska, and said that Konstancja Gładkowska does not cut the notes short, like another singer, Madame Meyer. Instead, she gives the notes their full value. Now, the upper example is the one that he draws when referring to Madame Meyer cutting the notes short. The lower example is the one he draws when referring to Konstancja Gładkowska giving the notes their full value. This is an intriguing symbol for giving notes their full value. It looks like a decrescendo hairpin. Indeed, this is a symbol used regularly in Chopin's notation, the long accent. And it comes from 2 traditions, one Viennese, the other bel canto. We see the bel canto tradition ensconced in this treatise of Manuel Garcia, the complete treatise of the art of singing. This is volume 2, in a section on tempo rubato, as you can see at the top. What Garcia does is to draw examples from Donizetti, Mozart, Rossini, and Zingarelli, and he takes the notated music and then shows in the lower box the execution, the Ausführung. So the first example in performance would become that kind of thing. So a lengthening and a leaning quality. Notated here with a conventional accent, but that's precisely the kind of quality that we will get in Chopin using the long accent, as I'll show you. So look at the Rossini example down bottom left. Becomes in performance, as it were. Nobody would sing it that metronomically, but you get the idea. Now, those are precisely the long accent leaning qualities that we find in Chopin. Indeed, there are 4 main categories that I found in my research on Chopin's long accents. Remember, these are tiny details. Just bear with me for a little bit, because we're going to move from detail to the conception of entire works using the long accent principle. I'm taking you on a journey. You must accept this. You have no control. Well, you could leave, but please don't. 4 categories, 4 habitual uses. He uses long accents on long notes, notes of long rhythmic value, for dynamic reinforcement, expressive stress, and simply writing it in proportion to the size of the note head. We have a second category, a leaning quality, which I call directional impulse, used for appoggiaturas, suspensions, and syncopations. Groups of notes, trills, acciacchaturas, grace notes, also appoggiaturas, suspensions, syncopations, lines to bring out, perhaps like that example I showed you from the letter. And finally, tied notes, often over the bar line in syncopation. Well, what difference does all of this make? If you look at this manuscript of Chopin, the Tutti from the E minor piano concerto, a manuscript that was given to his publisher Schlesinger, you'll see that it's a kind of textbook of these different types of long accent, which I've ringed for you. I'll see if I can play this. It's difficult to play holding a microphone and a clicker. So forth. These are very different articulations from the short, sharper, more focused accents that they are often replaced with in scores. Now, in my edition of the F minor concerto, we have an example of how the long accent appears, shown there, which comes from the manuscript. Kind of sustaining of the dissonance. Also with that underneath. Here another example. So this 2 nice juicy long accents for you, shown in the manuscript there. Now, I must admit, this manuscript shown here is a huge blow-up of something that's really tiny. It's like a postage stamp. So they look bigger than they really are, but of course the proportions are the same. Now, this is an especially interesting example used over a group of notes, this long accent, in the Stichverlage, the engraver's manuscript for the French first edition of the E minor prelude. Over a group of notes. In the French first edition, and I have 2 copies here, you'll see that the long accent is replaced by a conventional short accent on the C. Now, these two scores were used in lessons that Chopin taught to different students, Camille Dubois and Jane Sterling. And we have penciled into the scores in Chopin's hand identical fingering, 1 to 2 on the C, 1 to 2 on the C. Instead of correcting the short accent into a long accent, what Chopin does by adding this fingering is to create the effect of a long accent. Once asked me, do these tiny details matter? They go by so quickly. I suggested that he get a new job. I think they matter hugely. That's enough to kill me. But I'll try to keep going to the end of the paper. It's right into the chest register of the piano, so to speak. Chopin's alluding to the chest voice of the singer, and he uses a fingering to get this effect. I think this is a marvelous example of the composer's ear at work. We know it's Chopin's hand. This example at the bottom left is clearly Chopin standing, marking in the score. You've seen this in your own scores, I'm sure, whether of teachers or ones that you've marked in. Here's an even more intriguing example from the E minor concerto. In looking at the score of Camille Dubois in the Bibliothèque Nationale, I found 3 different fingerings or levels of fingerings, which is very, very difficult work because it's a mess. It's very difficult to decipher. So what we get is this. Each of these is consistent with fingering approach of Chopin, using a repeated finger, which of course you have to lift off the keys to create a kind of weighted portato effect. The middle fingering is the most intriguing. It's also the clearest to see in the score. The 3-5 at the beginning with the elision is absolutely clear. And what we have here in a fingering that nobody on earth would ever think was logical. I looked at it, I thought, this is not possible. What is Chopin getting at? It's not possible. It's weird. What he does with his fingering, if indeed it is Chopin, we have to accept that it may not be, it's a student copy, but it almost certainly is given the hand. What he achieves here is the effect of the long accent, the shape of the long accent. It's so beautiful. What you can do, because it comes in twice, you could do the first time 3-3-3, and then you could decide on the whole mood of your approach to that recapitulation based on that fingering, if you so wished. It's that important. These subtle nuances, these subtle inflections are wherein musical meaning lies. Musical meaning lies in these sorts of nuances. It's not written into the score as such. It's implied by this fingering, but it is for us to hear. It's for us to realize. It is for us to infer the meaning of. Now, one last example here before we press on. The Waltz in A-flat major, opus 34, number 1. We're now talking about the level of the overall form. This is a rhythmic reduction of the piece using a quarter note or crotchet, mixing up my countries, representing 16 bars. What I'm going to show you is a kind of living example of this quote from Edward Cohn. The composer, Cohn wrote, who really absorbed, digested, assimilated, and nourished himself on the four-measure concept was Chopin. The norm became so nearly instinctive that he could temper it with cross rhythms and syncopations in the large. This is a very perceptive observation of Cohn's. Now, what we have here is a standard waltz form with an introduction, then A section 32 bars, A section 32 bars, a B section 32. That's the waltz section. Then we have the trio, C, D, C, 16 bars each, and then the B comes back transposed into the key of the subdominant D flat. And then we have the reprise, standard reprise. But what Chopin does here is to extend one phrase, after which he then writes out a kind of long coda. Here's the cadential figuration in the first part. Which then becomes this. Play it, and I didn't. There you are. But you get the idea. So what was 4 bars is now 8. What that does is to create the effect of a prolongation, a kind of emphasis, rather like the long accent I'm talking about. And there is literally a forzato marking in the score as we embark on this trio, which builds and builds and builds and builds in excitement, and we finish the piece. Now, this paradigm is written into the score. It's up to the performer to decide what to do with it, but what I'm getting at here is a kind of potential energy written into the score through the prolongation, the forzato, the treatment of dynamics, and so forth. Chopin is building in the kind of potential shape that a performer can make his or her own as he wishes, as she wishes. What we're going to see in the final example is almost exactly this paradigm, but inferred from the performer's imagination, not at all from the notation. Quite an intriguing example. This issue of musical shape in the score has occupied much of my attention as someone who works on analysis and performance. I've produced graphs of dynamic shape here in the Handel variations of Brahms, the prevailing dynamic in each of the variations. So we have a kind of progression, a trajectory, which is gentle and then undulating, and then rapid oscillations, and then a huge sweep. And then, interestingly, Brahms keeps the energy very, very low for something like 8 variations. He keeps the lid down and thus builds an expectancy of change, which we get with this zigzagging, and then we're off into the fugue. Now, how you do it is up to you, but it's built into the score. There's a kind of dynamic shape, which you can understand both as a kind of physiognomy, a kind of mountain range in the distance, or as the kind of the breathing of the work, the landscape as you traverse it. These two things at the same time. Here's another example, the dynamic shape in the Nocturne C-sharp minor of Chopin. We have a huge, long, extended first section at pianissimo, and then we build, we fall, we build, we fall, we build, we fall, and then we return. So we get a sense of the shape, which is matched to some extent by the temporal shape. These are the properties, again, drawn from the score, as indeed are these of texture in a Rachmaninoff prelude. Now, what I would argue here, and I'm using these as quick examples to suggest, is that what the performer does is to sense from the materials in the score a potential shape that he or she can make his or her own in performance. There's a potential shape that we extract and then make our own. That's at least part of the creative practice of performance. So let's see this in operation in the final part of the presentation, creative performance in profile, a different sort of profile. And I'm going to take you to the Chopin competition of October 2015, when I was a member of the jury. This was a competition that lasted over 3 weeks of Chopin, sitting there listening to Chopin all day. There are worse things in life, I can tell you, but it was not easy. 155 Chopin recitals in the first round, 16 Chopin recitals a day over 5 days. I had thought that that practice would be banned by the EU, but it is still allowed. I don't know whether it's crueler to the contestants or to the members of the jury or both, but we all survived. So 3 rounds, elimination rounds moving from 77 to 43 to 20 contestants, and then finals with 10 people, 9 of whom played the E minor concerto. At the end of that, I really was a little bit tired of it. Having written a book about the concertos and edited the thing, I didn't want to see or hear that piece for a little while, but I've fallen back in love with it. You'll be very pleased to know. Now here's the room in question, quite a lot bigger than this glorious hall, and you can just make out, bottom right, a distinctive head, which is mine. If I were to lean over, I would not only humiliate myself, but point out the parallel with my head there. And to help you, I brought along this picture. It's of me in the corner, lurking, trying to summon the energy for yet another Chopin recital. So there we were, listening to Chopin in a space that Chopin would never, ever have played in. He never played in a room that big. This would be about the largest space Chopin ever played in. Now, I've just produced fairly recently an autoethnographic study about these experiences I had as a member of the jury. It was my first ever autoethnographic study. I wasn't planning to write a single thing as the competition took place. I was there doing a job, a very enjoyable job, a very stimulating job, but it really wasn't my goal to make research out of it. And yet I've done so in this article called Judging Chopin, an Evaluation of Musical Experience. I started to become really very interested in determining what it was I was listening for. How was I making these judgments? What was I picking up? How was I hearing Chopin? And against which criteria? In fact, there are a number of research foundations or axes that emerged in retrospect. As I said, I wasn't planning to do this as it happened. It was after the fact. But one body of research material that I was able to draw on later on was the literature on ethnography and autoethnography. And I was particularly inspired by an article by Joan Scott called The Evaluation of Experience. It's a fascinating article in which she questions the basis of much recounting of personal experience, suggesting that the experience is not what matters, it is the analysis of experience that matters. Analysis of experience against criteria, against cultural norms that we then question and shed light upon. And that's critical. If we're only telling about our experiences, we might as well be writing a blog. The second body of literature that I drew upon was that on adjudication, a very sizable body of literature. There was a lot of historical, psychological, and analytical research into music, including some by myself as well as others, and then my own experience as a performing musician, music teacher, and examiner and adjudicator. All of this was the background. This was not a background that I necessarily considered to be palpable or tangible during the jury experience, but it was there. It's the groundwork. Much of it, or at least the groundwork of the study that emerged from it. Now, what resources did I have? We always tell our students, if you're doing a practice-based thing, you better keep a practice diary or detailed notes and so forth. As I said, I wasn't planning to, but fortunately, I had the material to use. In the first place, I had extensive interview material. I was considered something of an oddity on the jury. The jury consisted of very distinguished musicians like Marta Argerich and Dmitry Alexiev and so forth, and I was there, the 17th member, and they always said to me, how does it feel being the only musicologist on the jury? It's like, how does it feel being the weirdo in the room, the person who doesn't really fit in? And I said to them in a kind of patient, tolerant voice, I'm there as a musician, not as a musicologist. Thank you. Please accept me for who I am. I'm not someone else. So the interviews allowed me to say what I was looking for, which was good. I also took notes. I'm going to show you some of my notes. I took notes during each performance. This was only for my own purposes, not for research. I'm a note taker. I wasn't taking notes in the introductions, as it happened, but I was tempted to because there were a few very interesting points. I like taking notes, so I have these notes. I have them at home, locked up. There were also the jury members' scores to look at. They're published online. They were released 2 days after the competition, launching an enormous argument in the blogosphere about the incompetence of some jury members. Fortunately not me, I was spared. But one of them was attacked savagely. It really was very ugly. Other judgments of pianists, so critical writings and so forth, all of which I could draw upon to see what other people thought of the people in question. Video recordings of the competitors all on YouTube, and of course editions of the music. Finally, published material about the competition itself. So ultimately, what was it I was looking for in judging pianists? Again, I didn't think this at the time, but what I really was looking for, above all else, was three things. First, outstanding pianistic ability. I'm afraid to say that the standard was so high, if you couldn't get through the A2 without note-free performance, you really didn't measure up. It really was very, very high. So you had to be pretty superb. That was not very interesting, though. It wouldn't get you very far. A second criterion that I defined was a deep understanding of Chopin. This is very problematic as a criterion. According to whom? Whose deep understanding? Who's Chopin, for that matter? You'll start to get a sense of what I mean by this in a minute. It's a very flexible notion, not a straitjacket. The third is perhaps the most difficult, but also the most important in a way, imaginative and uniquely personal assimilation of the music, a sense of ownership. Now, to a large extent, these three things worked together. If you had somebody who was simply an outstanding pianist, they didn't measure up. They weren't interesting. If you had somebody who was an outstanding pianist and played by the book, was a kind of deep understander of Chopin, so to speak, fine, but it wasn't very interesting either. It didn't engage. It wasn't original in some respect. We needed all three together. Now, this pianist was an intriguing one, to be sure. A Latvian pianist, Jurgis Osokins. Has anybody heard, I know one person here has because we've corresponded about him. Has anybody heard Osokins play, either live or in recording? Few people. Well, he was a bit of a sensation. You knew from the beginning that he would be a sensation because he had his own piano bench. He had the porters come along with a piano bench about this high. Glenn Gould, I thought, what's going on here? And he walked on stage and cut a very striking figure with his high collars and head thrown back and so forth. What we're going to do now is to hear a performance of his in the first round, which has served as one of two case studies in the autoethnographic article I've written. I'm going to talk about it and do an analysis of the performance as I heard it, although, of course, after the fact. This is the Etude in B minor, Opus 25, number 10. As I said, this is the first round. He was on, I think, the third day in the evening. So we'd already heard something like 45 recitals, and this particular performance stood out in my memory. All right, well, pretend you're on the jury. Consider yourself sitting in that desk, very long way from the stage. He's going on to the next piece. What are your reactions? What do you write down? What score do you give it? Who cares about the score? The score's not really interesting, but what are your reactions? What have you picked up? Anybody want to say? I'd be very interested to hear. There's no right and wrongs here. I'll tell you what I thought in a minute, but I wouldn't say that's right. Of course it is, but... Yes, Julian. Have you heard it before, Julian?
No, I think I have, yeah.
You shouldn't really, because you've heard it, but anyway. All right. Mm-hmm. Yep. No. That one line that he does in the reprise, it's like it's the killer. I'll play it again in a minute, and you'll be able to hear there's an enormous potency in those inner parts, absolutely. The energy, wonderful energy, but of course in the middle, then he pulls right back. Yeah. Anything else? Yes?
There's a lot of energy, but it's also a wonderful lyricism within the octaves that most kind of backs out these octaves.
Mm-hmm.
It really sounds like magic, but he's got a line behind the octaves in a way that's quite creative.
Okay, good. So huge amounts of energy, but harnessed particularly in the form of line, and inner lines too. Good. We could go on about this. This is always a very interesting exercise. What I'm going to do is show you my notes, which are here, cloaked in the anonymity of scroll. But because I'm a humane individual, I'll transcribe them. What I wrote in those hieroglyphic blips on the page is sensational, brings out inner suspension figure very prominently. Huge panache at the end of the first section, great tone. Middle section, sound, theme, more straight at first, second incarnation, varied. Superb pedaling, makes it painful, then releases. Transition indulgent, a bit unusual. Now these notes are perhaps interesting in themselves, but they're also very interesting for what they leave out. And this is a very important lesson, in my opinion, if we're looking at the evidence that comes out of ethnography or autoethnography. Looking at notes like this will not tell you what the person was thinking or feeling. Not the full picture. Same with composer sketches. We all know this, yet why do we study sketches as if they're telling us the answers? What I didn't record here was the overall shape of this performance, which is wherein lay, in my view, the genius of this performance, among other things. I think it's a very superb performance, although very, very radically different from what Chopin is likely to have done himself. I don't think that matters for reasons I'll talk about. What I found in analyzing these and other notes from the competition was that my reactions tended to break down into three categories: pianistic factors, expressive characteristics, musical process. So things like sound, tone, articulation, pedaling. Under expressive, mood, panache, painful, indulgence, a bit unusual. And then aspects of process. So tempo, rubato, dynamics, contrapuntal layering, melodic shape, harmonic shape, overall shape, including building from the start, panache, straight then varied, painful, pedaling, then resolution. Now remember those points in the back of your mind as we proceed. Here's the score. We do not have the scores in front of us. It didn't really matter because one hopes that the jury knew the pieces very, very well. But it's interesting to look at the score here. This is the end of the introduction. Now, the first thing that I was struck by was the fact that Osokins pulled right back at the end of that phrase, and I didn't note it down. It's not in the notes, yet it was hugely striking. Pulls right back. Then, that inner part, that I did note down. When you listen to it again, you'll hear that he anticipates that G. He wants us to hear it. So, this is a very Chopin-esque thing to do. The 6-5 motion is very, very typical of Chopin. We get it immediately after up an octave. Down, pulls right back. I remember thinking, what on earth is he doing? What use is he going to make of this, if any? And that was how I started to judge the coherence of a performance. What use did the pianists make of the gestures that they engaged in? Was there any use, or was it arbitrary? So he pulls right back. Now this is the second time I started to infer a pattern, and you mentally register that. Again, he brought out those inner 6-5 motions. Yadam, very prominently. And you think, what is he going to do with this? Well, here's the form of the piece in a kind of sectional breakdown. So we have introduction, A section repeated with codetta, and then B repeated B, and then this very gorgeous contrasting C section. It returns the B material. It comes again the C, and then back to B with a codetta, leading to a return of sorts of the introduction, and then finally the reprise. 2 sections, but rather different from before. Now, in the case of Osokins, what we had here were 2 particular strategies, and I would argue that these were strategies that I was able to pick up as I listened one and only one time in the whole of the competition. That's the critical thing. The after-the-fact analysis is interesting, but it is really, what are we listening for on the spot? What sense do we make as listeners, as adjudicators in this case? And here what we have is 2 sets of properties. First of all, retraction, that yada-da-dum. And then, at the end of the first section of the codetta, huge surge. This, it turns out, was a herald, a harbinger of what he was going to do later, this unleashing of energy that we get at the end. But in addition to that, we also have the contrapuntal motions that I've marked here on the left with the kind of long accent figures, which we hear as a kind of leitmotif, an expressive leitmotif in the performance. And indeed, contrapuntal foregrounding, contrapuntal shaping, which Julian mentioned a second ago as a reaction, is indeed one of the key forces, particularly in this middle section. When you listen again, listen very carefully to the ways in which lines come and go. Very, very Chopinesque treatment of line, coming, going, drawing the ear. And Osokins plays upon that masterfully. With more retraction in the second C section, he pulls the tempo right back, and it becomes tragic. It becomes painful. This is really threatening music in a way. We come back to the kind of piece of the B4 section as marked there, but the codetta takes us into a realm that doesn't feel comfortable to me. That's what I said was a bit unusual. It's not comfortable. There are other pianists too who found an enormous amount in this music. He pulls right back and then builds. Now, for me, the genius of the performance lay in the fact that when the material comes back at the end, having had the pattern established of retraction, we expect retraction. And what does he do? He reverses it. He doesn't pull back in that phrasing as and he goes for it. And by going for it, he unleashes that enormous energy, and it serves as a springboard. Now, the interesting thing here is that these properties are inferred by Osokins from his understanding of the music, not from the score. There are no score markings indicating this. This is his creative input, his creative inspiration. It's like the score-based diagram I showed you before, but it's coming from Osokins as performer. Or at least that is my hearing of it. I am making sense of the materials of the performance as presented to me. I'm involved in this too, and that is also very much part of what I'm trying to get across, that the creative practice of performance involves not only the performer, but those who are attending to, hearing, reacting to, responding to performance. So let's listen to this one more time, and then we'll wrap up. get here is these elements of musical process, among other things, becoming the basis of an emergent structure in performance. This now is musical structure, structure as inferred, structure as felt, structure as projected, structure as created, not simply interpreted. And we have Osokans to thank for that, as much as we do Chopin, of course. We also have our own creative response. It's all part of the mix, this broad participation, and indeed what I've tried to show here is an approach to practice-based research, which involves a party that normally is not included, and that is the listener. In this case, a special kind of listener, an adjudicator. But what I would say about this particular performance is that Osokans hit the nail on the three heads that I identified. Superb pianism. I'd love to play octaves like that. Wouldn't we all? Deep understanding of Chopin. Well, as I said a minute ago, I don't think for a second that Chopin would have played it like that. So how could he show a deep understanding of Chopin? By virtue of the understanding of the music in terms of its contrapuntal properties, in terms of the end-weighted quality of the music, going for the exciting finish, in terms of understanding the role of the octaves, which were not all about bombast, not all about raw energy, but about expression. Those are all very Chopinesque features, which I believe he harnessed in his uniquely personal, uniquely assimilated way. Hence, as it happened, the perfect score that I gave this, and very few performances in my notes. And that brings us to the end of this exercise of looking at performance as, feeling performance as a creative practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, so much. This is really the lecture that one wants to applaud standing. And I hope not one session on Chopin that John Rink will be moderating. That's tomorrow. Yeah. There will be one session tomorrow on Chopin. Is this one not working? Yeah. We'll hear another session on Chopin. John Rink will be moderating. Right, for another couple of recitals on Chopin. I guess it's